to another edition of The Author's Attic, a production of Social Problems, the official journal for the Society for the Study of Social Problems. This week we are joined by Kasey Henricks, whose article, I'm Principled Against Slavery But, Colorblind Racism and the Three-Fifths Debate, was recently published in Social Problems.
I begin the article by asking whether sociologists need a new paradigm for thinking about racial ideology. In our current one, we tend to describe racism as though it unravels in this progressively linear fashion. So scholars will use terms like new, aversive, symbolic, and modern racism to contrast present-day racial ideology from the past. And it's as though we have this model that bifurcates classical and modern forms of racial ideology that are separated by some type of clean or total break. So according to these prevailing theories, no longer is it acceptable to rationalize racial hierarchy in overt terms or on the basis of biologized difference. Instead, what you'll see is minorities that are being blamed for their own inequalities, oftentimes in a covert, underhanded fashion due to not appreciating values of hard work, prudent spending, delayed gratification, and so on. Because a large focus on contemporary racial ideology has been to explain how it changes over time, this body of work runs risk of reifying such change as though it's real and consequential from the start. So when we assume racial change as a taken-for-granted premise for our work, then the task of theory building follows this a priori logic to produce explanations that then go on to identify and define it. And this emphasis could have the unintended consequence of foreclosing upon questions that might otherwise challenge, or at the very least problematize, the very notion of change to begin with. I find this culture of knowledge production problematic because it leaves us unprepared to discuss some of the continuous qualities of racial ideology, let alone how change and continuity might simultaneously coexist. So what I attempt to do with this project is to take a number of insights that have recently been offered by those who have studied colorblind ideology and then transplant these insights into a historical soil that some presume that they don't belong at all. And I do this by formalizing the following research question. Was colorblindness a prevailing ideology when slavery was the dominant racial arrangement? Answering this question, I turn to a case of tax and representational debates of the 18th century, debates that culminated into the enactment of the Three-Fifths Clause. These debates are relevant to answer my research question because they make for a counterintuitive case study of colorblindness. That is, the Three-Fifths accomplished at least three color-conscious tasks upon its legal codification. It 1. Fractioned the personhood of slaves, 2. Confirm their dual status as person and property, and 3. Endorse slavery as the normative foundation for a formal racist state. For my data, I use archival material from the Library of Congress, the collection titled A Century of Lawmaking for a New Nation. This collection is an appropriate data set for studying the Three-Fifths Clause because it's among the most robust sources of a congressional record. So these documents showcase the discourses surrounding the clause all the way from its origins to its enactment. And the collection contains source books of original records of the debates that were kept by those who actually participated in these debates firsthand. As far as the sampling procedure goes, my documents were selected according to whether or not they contain the words three-fifths, and this procedure yielded about 1,500 pages of primary text that span from about 1775 to 1789. So there's much more that I can actually go on and say about the methods of this paper, like who participated in the debates, how much, or how I cross-reference documents to confirm patterns of discourse, or the procedure that I use to calculate intercoder reliability. But for sake of time, let me go ahead and move on to my coding procedure. So my coding decisions consisted of identifying patterns of abstract liberalism, or what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls the cornerstone of colorblind ideology. So let me define exactly what I mean by colorblindness. It's an ideology that does not ignore race altogether. Rather, it justifies racial inequality as an outcome of non-racial dynamics. So according to Bonilla Silva, colorblind ideology consists of at least 4 frames: abstract liberalism, minimization, cultural racism, and naturalization. The most important of these is abstract liberalism. It appeals to decontextualized notions of liberalism both in an economic and political sense, and it even condemns overt expressions of prejudice, but it does so in ways that often safeguard white interests. So during the time period of my case study, racial inequality was not colorblind in the sense that slaves were denied basic rights of citizenship and subjected to total white domination, oftentimes through violence. But I argue that slavery was colorblind to the extent that slave masters and accommodators alike affirmed appeals to liberalism while they simultaneously diminished the significance of slavery altogether. So in place of hollow disclaimers that we overhear today like, quote unquote, I'm not racist, but ... the founding fathers actually used phrases like, well, I'm principled against slavery, but ... And here, the contraction but signals a conscious misdirection. It signposts an acknowledgement that the forthcoming claim will in fact not be principally against slavery. So after Hugh Williamson of North Carolina uttered these words, he followed them with a plea for low taxes on slaves. Quote, he said, he thought slaves were an encumbrance to society instead of increasing its ability to pay. So hardly a rejection of human bondage, Williamson actually used colorblindness to advance fiscal policy that would subsidize slavery through foregone tax revenue. But by first insisting that he opposed slavery on principled grounds, he was able to take the moral high ground on an issue that was politically contentious. By taking what we know of racism today, and then transplanting these insights into historical soil that some presume they don't belong, my goal has been to question whether or not a classical modern dichotomy accurately describes ideological change. So words like modern racism and new racism signal a sequence whereby the present breaks from the past. But my analysis historicizes colorblindness to draw attention to a relationship that our conceptual language wants to deny. That is, remarkably different structures rooted in fundamentally unique political economies can nonetheless be rationalized by common ideological currents. Now, not to understate the particularities of racial orders that do vary across time, there are radically different relations between the historical slave and today's racialized division of labor. But yet at the same time, it's important to recognize that racial discourses overheard today, captured in phrases like, quote, I'm not racist, but, have deep historical antecedents that predate the current moment, like, I'm principled against slavery, but. So this means that colorblindness was not created out of whole cloth during post-1960s America. Rather, it's part and parcel to the heavy historical hand of white supremacy that reaches all the way back to the foundation of slavery.